afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all well. So last time on Friday, we looked, sorry, at Tuesday, but it's Friday today. Last Tuesday, we looked at the Maccabees and the family of the Maccabees and how they eventually won what they wanted, which was political and religious freedom from the Greeks, the Seleucids. The family name were the Seleucids, and they won their freedom through a war, a guerrilla war that then became a national war, and they were now free to rule themselves. And as we said the last time, the name Maccabees is only a nickname given mostly to one of the Maccabees called Judas, because he was such an effective fighter. So he was called the Hammer, which is the English word for Maccabees, or Maccabee, I suppose. Anyway, it's the Hebrew word for hammer. And the name stuck. However, the real name of the family of the Maccabees was the Hasmoneans. They were called the Hasmoneans. And so they were the ones that were now ruling the Holy Land in place of the Seleucids. And in fact, their rule was so effective, they captured all the territory that the borders which King David and his son Solomon had achieved in their time, hundreds of years before. They were restored. So they were able to get back all the territory that David and Solomon had. A great achievement. But as time went on, the Hasmoneans got drawn into the same type of power struggle between members of the dynasty, members of the family, which we saw had plagued and played out in the lives of the Seleucids. This division among the ruling authorities, the lack of stable government that it caused, made the people restive. And what governments and empires do not want is restive populations, because they have to send their soldiers in and quell everything down. You can see how the situation that will pertain when Jesus comes to live among us is already being developed. The Jews getting restive for one reason or another, and the rulers, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans, not liking it and sending in the troops. And the people were also resentful. They were restive because they were resentful that the Hasmoneans had come, the Maccabees had come to power with the purpose of restoring the purity of Jewish life, when in the later generations of the Hasmoneans, former Maccabees, they began to give way to Greek practices. Some of the rulers took a Greek name. They call themselves by the Greek word for king, which is basileus, on their coinage. So they were really opening themselves up to this pagan influence, and the people, the ordinary people who wanted to practice their Jewish faith properly, were not happy. Now, the group that was organizing this resistance to the Greek way of life that the rulers were in favor of were, as we've heard before, the name, the Pharisees. This is where they come into the picture, who, of course, we will meet frequently opposing Jesus, when he comes on the scene. This group of the Pharisees now spearhead the opposition to the Hasmoneans, the rulers. And the Pharisees are saying that the Hasmoneans are not real priests, they're not real Jews, that, you know, they aren't in the Levitical line of the priesthood. Remember Moses, the 12 tribes of Israel, the Levites were the priests, and they had the privilege of sacrificing in the temple as priests. Now, the Pharisees are saying that the Hasmoneans are not real priests anyway, and so they shouldn't be. And what they wanted was, they said that they were profaning the office of the high priest, the one who goes into the temple to offer the sacrifice 3 times a year into the Holy of Holies. And that they were hypocrites, basically, and they just wanted military and political power, and they were doing all they could to hold on to that. They weren't really spiritual. They weren't doing what God wanted, basically. So the Pharisees wanted, who were the good guys at the moment, they wanted to abolish the idea of having a king at all, a king of Judea. And they wanted to replace him with having the high priest as the ruler, to have not a king, but a theocracy, i.e., a rule under God, that the high priest would be as it were, the vicar of God, the substitute for God, and it would all be under God's rule. So they wanted it very different, even from the time when King David was king. You know, it wasn't a theocracy then; it was a kingship under David and Solomon. But they wanted the Pharisees wanted all that changed, and they wanted the high priest to be the ruler, ideally, to ensure the purity of Jewish life in this constant battle with Greek customs that was watering down the purity of Jewish life. Into this situation of unrest, who stepped in but Rome? And they took control because there was no unity, because they were all divided. Divide and conquer is the famous Roman phrase, divide and conquer. And in the year 64 BC, just 64 years before Jesus comes, the stage is being set for the way the world will be when Jesus comes among us. A Roman called Pompey, who was a brilliant Roman consul, because they had before they had a Caesar in Rome, they had this system of consuls that used to rule. And he was a consul. He was elected into power by the Senate. And this brilliant young Roman consul was captured the city of Antioch in Syria, which Syria is just north from the Holy Land, and ended the empire of the Seleucids, the Greek Empire, forever. So the Greeks have now gone. The Romans have now taken over. Where the Greeks took over from the Persians, now the Romans take over from the Greeks. So Pompey now has Syria to the north of the Holy Land. Now he turns his eyes south to Jerusalem. And very soon afterwards, he captured that city, Jerusalem, after a long siege, in which he surrounded the city and forced the Jews to capitulate to him. And Pompey wasn't a particularly good person. He was a man very insensitive to religion. And he actually went when he conquered Jerusalem, he went to the temple, and he not only entered its precincts, which were reserved for Jews only. There's a section in the temple precincts that ordinary pagans could go into, devout pagans. But ordinary Jews were not allowed any further than their own precinct. There's a women's precinct as well.
Oh gosh, it's fantastic.
Is everybody all right? You okay? Not only anyway, he not only did that, but he went into the temple itself, and he even went into the Holy of Holies itself, where the temple sacrifice is made, and only the high priest is allowed to enter the Holy of Holies in the temple. Pompey went right in there. Sacrilege. This sacrilege the Jews were never to forget. But Pompey allowed the Hasmoneans to govern under Roman rule. Then the next step in the preparation for the incarnation of Jesus was when Pompey, this man who conquered Jerusalem, was thrown out by Julius Caesar. We've all heard of Julius Caesar, Shakespeare play, all that. He now took power. And Julius Caesar appointed Herod, who wasn't from Judah as such. He was from the north. He was a sort of a half-breed, Herod. He was an Idumean. Idumea is to the north. That's where he was born. And he was half Idumean and half Jewish. But he was a very good administrator. And the Romans liked him, and they appointed Herod to rule the Holy Land and made him king under Roman rule in 40 BC, just 40 years before Jesus is about to come. So Jesus would be born into the kingdom of Judah with Herod as king. He has been called Herod the Great. He was an excellent ruler. He extended Judah's power politically and economically within Roman power, within the Roman Empire, through diplomacy. He was a great diplomat. He was able to argue his case very well. He knew how to keep the Romans happy with stable and prosperous government with no unrest. What the Romans wanted was peace. They wanted a peaceful country so they didn't have to send their soldiers in and sort things out because it all cost money. What they wanted is good government. And Herod was providing them with that. But he was also in favor of Greek customs, and because he was pro-Roman and the Romans were carrying on the Greek culture, and he founded many cities in Judea which were designed on Greek lines, very different from Jewish cities. So these Greek cities had theatres where Greek plays would have been played, baths, Roman baths, Greek baths, marketplaces, gymnasia for keeping fit, and temples to the Greek gods. So he balanced all this with being pro-Greek, pro-Roman, with also great respect for the Jewish way of life. He wanted to try to have his cake and eat it. And he rebuilt the temple magnificently. This is the time when the temple became the most magnificent building probably in the world. Because as you know, Solomon built the first temple, and then that was destroyed by the Assyrians in 597 BC, I think, something like that. And then it was the Jews came back and they rebuilt the temple on fairly modest lines. It wasn't anything like Solomon's first temple. It wasn't as grand as that. And that was how it was until Herod came to power. And then he decided to have a big, huge building project of completely reconstructing the temple using Greek architecture on a magnificent scale. This is the temple that Jesus would know when he comes to Jerusalem. Herod's magnificent temple. And it was still being rebuilt while Jesus was among us. the rebuilding carried on until 64 AD. So 30 years after the crucifixion, the temple was still being embellished and built and built up. Tragically, finished in 64, and then in 70, it was completely destroyed. In 7 years, it was only completed 7 years, and then the Romans completely destroyed it, utterly destroyed it. But that'll come later. So, despite Herod's attempts to win over the Jews by these great building projects and respect for the Jewish way of life, he never really won the respect of the Jews, because he was basically a diplomat, interested only in his own power. He wasn't really interested in anybody else but his own power. Playing the Romans' game, currying the Romans, and playing and keeping the Jews happy as possible. And in his own life, he didn't have a successor properly, because he was always getting rid of opposition, because he was only interested in his own power, not really thinking into the future about providing stable government for the future. And what happened when he died, in his will, his kingdom that he'd built up so carefully and been so diplomatic about, and left a very stable government, when he died, it had to be divided between his 3 sons. And it's these 3 sons that will be in power immediately when the incarnation comes to happen. And this division of the country politically would spell disaster in the years following the incarnation, the resurrection of Christ, and the with Roman power, because ultimately in AD 70, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. So we'll talk about all that next time. So this is setting the scene for the immediate years just before the incarnation is going to take place, talking about Herod and the way Jerusalem was being governed at that time, and the whole of Judah was, and the Pharisees. So how all that was in place when Jesus came to earth. Okay, so God bless you. Talk more about that next time. See you next time.
Thank you very much, Father John.
Thank you, Father John.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Father John.